Let's just tap into this story for a second. I mentioned this at the beginning of the hour. 41% of the UK public view China as a critical threat and oppose deepening economic ties with the country. That's according to a new survey by the British Foreign Policy Group. The upsurge in anti-Chinese sentiment comes after an intense focus on the role of Beijing in Britain's infrastructure, including, of course, that decision to ban Huawei for the 5G network, political repression of people in Hong Kong, and incarceration of certain minorities as well. Within the last year, there's been a 30% rise in the number of Brits who regard China as a critical threat to the UK, while 15% don't want any level of engagement with the Chinese government at all. Let's speak with Sir Malcolm Rifkind, former Foreign Secretary. Afternoon to you, Sir Malcolm. Should we still trust China?
Well, trust is a very, very questionable word. Trust in China's a fact of life. It's the elephant in the sitting room, as it were. You can't ignore it. But I think the reaction of your poll from the British public has been significantly influenced by Chinese behaviour in Hong Kong. The United Kingdom, more than any other country in the world, has a deep interest, empathy, support for the people of Hong Kong. Yeah. And we've seen how they've been trashed by the government in Beijing. So that's bound to have had a very negative impact on how people see Xi Jinping, the Chinese leader, and the sort of system that he operates under. There
does seem to be a kind of a trilogy here of events. I mean, we obviously have coronavirus and a big sense of that being underplayed. But whatever the rights or the truths of that are, there's certainly a sense that we're not quite hearing the full story of how this thing began. As you rightly say, Sir Malcolm, that the Hong Kong issue of repression, the incarceration of religious minorities and the like, I mean, it's a pretty grim picture. It almost sounds like a set of events that you might have got out of China 30 years ago, not in the 21st century.
It is a very grim picture, because although there was some naivety a few years ago when people hoped and thought that China, having adopted a more capitalist economic system, would gradually liberalize its political system as well, that might have been slightly naive. But what no one anticipated or could have anticipated when Xi Jinping came to power is that he would not only not make progress in opening up China, but would set it backwards in the opposite direction and making it more totalitarian for its own people, quite apart from its aggression towards its neighbors. So the people of China, not just the Uyghurs in the West who've had the most terrible treatment, but also over 1 billion Chinese do not have even the freedoms that people in Russia have under Mr. Putin.
Yeah,
it's a very bad system.
I mean, you're absolutely right. I mean, this was the interesting thing. I think we were all, I don't know if the word is duped, but there was certainly that sense when we saw the Chinese president pressing the flesh on the big red carpets at state events, presidents, prime ministers. And I think that certainly when I was covering these stories and looking at news footage of this man, I'm thinking, this is the new face of China now. This is what it's going to look like. It's modernized. A lot of the old stuff has gone out and we'll see something completely different. I've been duped, Sir Malcolm, right? I mean, this isn't the case. As you say, it's gone backwards, not forwards.
It's gone backwards. And of course, what Xi Jinping, the current leader, models himself on is Mao Zedong, who was a totalitarian dictator. What we've got to recognize is that China has suddenly emerged as a global superpower. It's all happened very late in the day, because what they have done is given up some of the lunacies of the communist economic system. So although they're still called a communist party, what we're actually seeing is Chinese nationalism. China, having become a very powerful economic and political state with a strong military capability, is now acting in a very aggressive way. And it's not just Hong Kong. It's basically all China's neighbors. Forget the United States and the United Kingdom for the moment.
Yep.
If you just look at the countries that border China, all the way from Japan in the northeast, through South Korea, to Taiwan, to Vietnam, to Malaysia, right across to India, they are all feeling worried, if not frightened, of the way China is behaving towards them. So what we're seeing is a gradual alliance, an informal one at this stage, being formed of all those countries on the Indo-Pacific rim. And the United States, of course, has a crucial role, because we often forget this. We think of the United States as an Atlantic ally. It is an Atlantic ally, but it's also a Pacific state.
Sure.
It has oceans on either side. And the Pacific, its nearest neighbor across the Pacific is China. So they have a very natural strategic interest in the way the Chinese government are behaving.
Who is going to take on President, or should I say Chairman Xi, which I think is still the official title of his party? I mean, we know that, whatever people thought about Donald Trump, there was very much a sense that, Trump might not have been everybody's cup of tea, but if anyone was going to take on the Chinese president, it was him.
Well, I didn't go along with that point of view. The problem with Trump was basically the man himself. His personality was such that he was erratic, he was unpredictable, and he just could not deliver results. Any president of the United States or any head of government who wakes up in the morning and makes policy by tweeting without even consulting his closest colleagues what he's saying and how he's saying it is a menace to the peace of the world. And when you're president of the United States, it means you're even more of a menace. Now, Xi Jinping is not in that situation. Xi Jinping is a very clever, very controlled, very calculating man. In some ways, that makes him more dangerous.
Yeah, sure.
But he's not after a world war. He just, quite often people talk about this beginning of a new Cold War. I know what they're saying, but I think it's a slight mistake. The Cold War, which we all had to live through in the United Kingdom for 50 years with the Soviet Union, that's when the Soviet Union represented a global ideology called communism.
Of course.
And communism meant something at that time. It was very powerful in France and Italy, as well as in communist countries. And the Soviets already controlled half of Europe, including half of Germany, right, including Berlin. So we're not in that territory. China's not going to invade the rest of the world, except possibly Taiwan. That is the one country that faces a real risk.
Sure. But so what is that the manifestation of their dominance and their growth is likely to be in what area? Purely economic? Is it will we see more plastic rubbish coming our way because of
well, we might, but that's not
Chinese factories? Is it that? Is it global economic dominance? If you say it's not military, then what is it?
Well, I didn't say it wasn't military dominance. I said what they're unlikely to do is actually physically invade other countries. What they basically want to do is to be acknowledged by all their neighbors, by the whole of Asia, and increasingly by the rest of the world, as the most powerful country in the world, so that you don't take issue with what China will make demands, and you will be expected to meet them. Now, I don't want to exaggerate the issue. We're not in that territory as we speak, but you will have seen how even countries like Australia and Norway, the Norwegian government dared to give the Nobel Prize to a Chinese dissident, and immediately we had massive sanctions imposed upon them. Australia called for an inquiry into the origins of the pandemic, and Australia suddenly finds that a lot of its exports are being blackballed. So China is trying to use its economic muscle, not trying to, it is using its economic muscle,
sure,
try and punish countries, governments, people who don't happen to agree with them. Now, this is all very dangerous stuff, because although I don't think they want to have a war, a major war, these things can happen sometimes almost by accident. The nearest equivalent I can think of historically is when Germany under the Kaiser, in the late 19th century, suddenly became a very powerful state and tried to catch up on the rest of the world and behaved in a very aggressive way under the Kaiser, which led to the First World War. Now, I don't think that's going to happen because we have the added drama of nuclear weapons. And all countries know that if you ever use nuclear weapons, you could endanger the whole planet. So I don't think that's what the Chinese government's contemplating, but it is acting aggressively against India. There was a border dispute just a few weeks ago with 20 Indian soldiers who were killed. Vietnam, which should have no love for America, Vietnam of all countries, still a communist country, says America is our ally. It's China we are worried about. Yeah. Now, that's an astonishing statement.
Indeed. Incredibly significant. Sir Malcolm, thank you. Sir Malcolm Rifkind, former Foreign Secretary, on that issue of China.